In the 2nd century BC, if we look down over Eurasia from above, we would see several centers of civilization undergoing dramatic change. In the Mediterranean, the Roman Republic was expanding at a staggering pace. It had defeated Macedon, subdued the Greek city-states, destroyed Carthage, and was drawing ever more war booty, slaves, silver, and provincial taxes into Italy. In the lower Nile Valley, Ptolemaic Egypt was still wealthy. It possessed Alexandria, papyrus, grain, Mediterranean trade, and a highly centralized royal treasury. But this Hellenistic kingdom had already begun to weaken under internal strife, foreign wars, and pressure from Rome. Farther west in Asia, the Seleucid Empire was in decline, while Parthia was rising. The old empire's territories were being carved apart, and a new cavalry empire was taking control of the Iranian plateau and pushing toward Mesopotamia. In India, the Mauryan Empire had collapsed. Northern India had entered an age in which new dynasties, Hellenistic powers, and regional states overlapped. The region still had a large population, advanced agriculture, and active trade, but its level of political integration was no longer what it had been under Ashoka. And in this turbulent world, a very unusual state appeared in the east, the Han Empire. It did not become wealthy by constant outward conquest in the Roman manner. It did not turn the entire country into a royal estate, as Ptolemaic Egypt had done. Nor did it build power through military aristocrats and cavalry expansion, as Parthia did. Its wealth came mainly from within: population recovery, agricultural expansion, low taxes, iron tools, irrigation, granaries, household registration, and an increasingly mature bureaucratic system. If we use the 2nd century BC as our fixed point of comparison, we can reach a very clear conclusion. The Han Empire was unquestionably one of the most brilliant, wealthy, and organizationally capable states in the world at that time. And if we look only at population size, agricultural foundations, state fiscal reserves, and internal capacity for recovery, it had very likely already surpassed the Roman Republic of the same period. But the truly surprising part is not that conclusion. It is where the story begins. Around 200 BC, the Han Empire was almost unbelievably poor. The Han Dynasty was founded in 202 BC. At that time, China was not a naturally prosperous, orderly country waiting for a new dynasty to take over. It had just endured decades of almost continuous warfare. First, the wars of annexation at the end of the Warring States period, then the Qin Wars of unification, then the Great Rebellions against Qin, and finally the Chu-Han War. The result of this long period of war was a sharp decline in population, abandoned farmland, ruined transport networks, fewer livestock, destroyed farming tools, and countless households that had lost their adult male labor force. It was the collapse of an entire social system of production. The new dynasty inherited a society hollowed out by war. In many places, fields had gone back to weeds, villages were ruined, and grain supplies were insufficient. When the founding emperor traveled, he could not even find 4 horses of the same color to pull his carriage. Court ministers lacked proper carriages and horses as well, and had to ride to court in ox carts. Across a territory of more than 3 million square kilometers, the population was only a little over 10 million. We do not have precise GDP statistics for that age, but if even the rulers of the empire were living in such embarrassment, we can only imagine what life was like for ordinary people. And yet, in less than half a century, the situation changed completely. During the reigns of Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, roughly from 180 to 141 BC, the Han population recovered from the 10 million plus range at the dynasty's founding to the 30 million plus range. The land tax remained extremely low for a long period. In 167 BC, the central government even abolished the national land tax for a time. Corvée labor was reduced, the poll tax was lowered, and the destructive force of the legal system was softened. By the time Emperor Wu came to the throne, state granaries and fiscal reserves had already accumulated enough resources to support the large-scale frontier wars that followed. This period is known as the rule of Wen and Jing. It is often described as the first golden age recorded in Chinese history. More than 2,000 years later, modern China began reform and opening in 1978, and in less than half a century became the second largest economy in the world. In both cases, a country rose from devastation and underdevelopment to enormous economic strength. In that sense, the early rise of the Han Empire has many subtle parallels with China's modern rise. Deng Xiaoping, the chief architect of China's reform and opening, once made a famous statement: "Science and technology are the primary productive force." That sentence helped shape a fundamental strategic shift in early reform-era China. Learning technology, developing technology, and treating technology itself as a factor of production. If we turn our gaze back 2,200 years to the rule of Wen and Jing, we can see that technology also played a foundational role in the Han Empire's journey from poverty to wealth. From Qin to the middle of the Western Han, northern China completed a crucial technological transition. Iron tools gradually moved from being expensive objects in the hands of nobles and armies to becoming basic tools of ordinary agricultural production. By the Qin and Han periods, iron was no longer just a material for weapons. It had entered farming tools, handicraft production, transport and construction. This does not mean that every farmer immediately owned a full set of iron tools, nor does it mean that the Han had entered anything like the modern industrial age. But it does mean that iron ploughs, iron hoes, iron sickles and iron axes were appearing in the fields in increasing numbers. Wooden and stone tools could open land, but they were inefficient, wore out quickly, and had limited ability to deal with hard soil or deep ploughing. At one remarkably well-preserved Western Han agricultural site, researchers found ridges, roads, houses, wells, latrines, grinding stones, iron sickles, iron axes, iron ploughshares, and even the footprints of people and oxen left in the fields. This was not a court record, nor a later legend. It was a cross-section of a Western Han village sealed in the soil. It shows that around the time of Wen and Jing, agriculture in northern China was not primitive, scattered or inefficient. It already possessed a fairly mature system of field management, tools, and animal power. These innovations may not have transformed agriculture as radically as chemical fertilizers would in later times. They may have improved each household's efficiency only a little. But in an agricultural society, a little more per household, multiplied by millions of households, becomes imperial-level wealth growth. Crop structure was just as important. In the past, some people tended to write Western Han agriculture as a simple linear story in which wheat rapidly replaced millet. But newer archaeological research reminds us that the reality was more complicated. In the political core regions, millet crops still dominated. Wheat expanded in certain areas, but it did not immediately become the staple everywhere. Modern archaeobotanical research shows that agriculture in the Han core regions was not based on a single crop. It relied mainly on drought-resistant grains such as foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, while gradually absorbing wheat, soybeans, rice and other crops. Foxtail millet and broomcorn millet were drought-resistant and matured quickly, making them suitable for the dry environment of the north. Wheat had higher yield potential, but required more moisture and more demanding processing conditions. Rice was suitable for the south and for regions with abundant water. This kind of multi-crop system meant that the empire's food security did not depend on a single climatic window. If one crop failed, another might still sustain households and state granaries. Modern carbon isotope research can even estimate water conditions and yields from ancient charred wheat grains. Related studies estimate that wheat yields in northern China over the past 4,000 years ranged from roughly 0.5 to 2.5 tons per hectare. On land with good water conditions, yields could be far higher than on ordinary dry fields. This means irrigation was not a decorative improvement. It was a multiplier of grain production. And that brings us to the third technological force, water. The Qin and Han empires inherited and expanded the large-scale hydraulic traditions of the Warring States period. Major canal systems, dikes, reservoirs, wells, irrigation ditches, and small-scale local waterworks together form the infrastructure of agricultural production. For example, Dujiangyan, first built during the Qin period, was extensively modified and upgraded during the Han, and it remains one of the irrigation sources for the Chengdu Plain to this day. Of course, irrigation had costs. Recent environmental history research has pointed out that agricultural intensification and large-scale water projects in the Han period were intertwined with more frequent flood pressure in the Yellow River Basin. In other words, Han technological progress was not a fairy tale. It increased yields, but it also changed environmental risks. Yet during the rule of Wen and Jing, the most important effect was that the state reorganized war-damaged land, population and tools and brought the agricultural system back into operation. There was another technology that is easily overlooked: standardization. The Qin dynasty had left behind unified weights and measures, currency, roads, documents, and administrative divisions. These continued to matter in the early Han. This may sound less vivid than an iron plough, but it was extremely important for the economy. Unified standards meant that grain, cloth, coins, land, and taxes could be compared, recorded, and transferred. Roads and relay stations meant that orders, tax grain, and military supplies could move across regions. Granary systems meant that grain was not merely consumed, but could be concentrated, stored, distributed, and transported. This was the solid technological foundation possessed by the early Han Empire. In farming, iron tools, crop systems, irrigation, and standardization, it laid the strongest possible foundation for the growth of an agricultural society. And on top of that foundation, if the right political and economic measures were adopted, economic development would follow naturally. Besides these four crucial technological evolutions that liberated productive capacity in an agricultural society, we must also mention several other world-leading achievements in early Han technology. First, in metallurgy, as just mentioned, Han craftsmen inherited and greatly developed blast furnace and cupola furnace technology. The key was that, through improved bellows and the use of refractory materials, furnace temperatures could steadily exceed 1,200 degrees Celsius, fully melting iron ore into liquid metal. This meant the Han Empire could cast iron tools at scale, much as earlier craftsmen had cast bronze vessels. By contrast, although the Roman Republic of the same period had very high-quality forging techniques, its smelting technology was still based on bloomery iron. Roman smiths had to repeatedly hammer iron masses in a solid state to remove impurities, which meant iron objects in the West long remained expensive and semi-customized handmade goods. During this period, the Han Empire also produced a remarkable machine that changed the history of farming: the seed drill. This was an iron implement with a three-legged structure that could open furrows, sow seeds, and cover the soil in a single process, while also ensuring consistent spacing between rows. Its sowing efficiency was more than 10 times that of hand sowing. At the same time, the design of Han plowshares reached a classical peak. Through improvements to the curved surface of the moldboard, heavy Han plows could easily turn up deep soil and cover weeds completely, greatly enhancing soil fertility. According to comparisons made by agricultural historians, a Han farmer using 1 or 2 oxen with this efficient plow could cultivate far more effectively than the heavy, poorly turning smooth plows used in Europe before the 18th century. In textiles, Han's silk technology also reached its first great peak. By the Wen and Jing period, treadle looms were already capable of handling extremely precise warp and weft relationships. Some excavated silk fabrics from the time have been measured at densities of up to 220 warp threads per centimeter. Romans at this time were skilled at producing wool and linen, but they knew nothing about the biological production of silk fiber. Some Roman writers even absurdly believed that silk was a kind of downy fiber collected from trees. In the media of information storage and transmission, the Wen and Jing period also planted seeds that would later transform the world. Although traditional historiography credits the invention of paper to Cai Lun in a later age, modern archaeology has found fragments of primitive fiber paper in tombs from the Wen and Jing period. This means that as early as the 2nd century BC, the Han Empire was already trying to break free from heavy bamboo slips and expensive silk. By sharp contrast, the Mediterranean world of the same period still relied heavily on papyrus from Egypt. Papyrus was light, but because of the limitations of its plant fibers, it decayed easily in humid environments, and its production was entirely dependent on the geography of the Nile Valley. Another medium, parchment, was durable but extremely expensive. Making a single book could require slaughtering an entire herd of animals. The Han Empire's exploration of how to turn cheap plant fibers into a light writing medium provided the material foundation for the vast civil bureaucracy and scholarly institutions that came later. When historians and economists explain what the Han Empire did right during the rule of Wen and Jing, there are 4 Chinese characters that cannot be avoided. Xiaoyang Shengxi. This was not a moral slogan, it was a very concrete fiscal arrangement. The main sources of revenue for the early Han Empire were not overseas trade, commercial tariffs or large-scale state monopolies. They were land, population, and labor service. In other words, the wealth the state could actually obtain came from the grain of farming households, the poll tax paid by adults, and the labor and military service performed by adult men. Therefore, the most important policy of the Wen and Jing period was not for the government to create wealth directly. It was for the government to reduce its immediate extraction from farming families, giving them time to restore production, keep surplus grain to feed their households, and return labor to the land. Letting the people and the strength of the people recover, reproduce, and grow. In modern economic language, it meant cultivating and expanding the tax base. Start with a land tax. The early Han land tax was already much lower than that of Qin. Under Emperor Gaozu, the basic tax rate was 1 part in 15, or about 6.7% of agricultural output. Under Emperor Wen, the land tax was further reduced to 1 part in 30, or about 3.3%. Later, it was at times reduced to 1 part in 60, or about 1.7%. In 167 BC, Emperor Wen directly abolished the national land tax. This policy continued until Emperor Jing restored it to 1 part in 30. For an agricultural empire to voluntarily push its core land tax to such a low level was extremely rare in the entire history of Imperial China. Many ancient states raised taxes after war, using heavier extraction to repair fiscal deficits. The Han government under Wen and Jing did the opposite. It placed fiscal pressure on government spending and frontier logistics, rather than on the farming households that had only just begun to recover. This produced a direct effect. Farmers kept more grain. In an agricultural society, grain is not just a consumer good. It is food, seed, animal fodder, household savings, and insurance against disaster. When the government took less grain, farming households did not merely eat a little more. They could keep more seed, raise more livestock, repair more tools, and sustain more family members. In modern economic terms, their disposable income rose substantially, giving them stronger risk resistance and a greater willingness to invest and expand production. At the same time, low taxes reduced the pressure that drove people to flee, hide from household registration, sell land, or fall into bankruptcy. Now look at the poll tax. Besides the land tax, Han fiscal revenue also included a cash tax levied by person. During the Wen and Jing period, the poll tax was reduced from 120 coins to 40 coins. This was extremely important. Unlike the land tax, the poll tax was not based on output. It was based on the number of people. For poor households, its pressure was often harsher than the land tax. In a bad harvest year, land tax fell along with output, but the poll tax still had to be paid. The more adults a family had, the greater its cash burden. If it also had to perform labor service, the household would lose both labor and money at the same time. Lowering the poll tax reduced the cost for ordinary families of remaining inside the registered household system. This also served the state's interests. What the early empire feared most was not that one farming family paid too little, but that farming families left the registration system altogether. Once they fled, the state could no longer tax them, conscript them, or even count them. The core of Wen and Jing policy was to make it worthwhile for ordinary people to remain registered with the state. If taxes were low, labor service was light, and legal risks were reduced, farming households were more willing to maintain registration, cultivate land, and raise children. Short-term tax revenue fell, but the long-term tax base expanded. The corvée system worked the same way. Both Qin institutions and early Han institutions depended heavily on compulsory labor. Roads, palaces, border defenses, transport, and granaries all required people. The problem was that corvée labor did not take idle people away from households. It took away the adult laborers with the highest productive capacity. If an adult man left home for 1 month of service, the loss was not just 1 month of time. It disrupted the entire agricultural rhythm of sowing, harvesting, transport, tool repair, and caring for livestock. Under Emperor Wen, the frequency of labor service was reduced to roughly once every 3 years, and the age at which adult males became liable for service was pushed back to around 20. In practice, this kept young and strong laborers inside the household economy. The government did not hand cash subsidies to farmers, nor did it organize complex agriculture investment programs. It simply reduced extraction, allowing farming households to repair production on their own. For a society that had just experienced long warfare, this was more effective than short-term fiscal stimulus. When land was abandoned, tools were broken, livestock were scarce, and population was insufficient, the scarcest resource was not government orders. It was stable labor time. After reducing the land tax and the poll tax, in other words, after greatly increasing the disposable income and available time of ordinary people, the Han Empire's third policy was aimed precisely at creating a looser social and legal environment. In 167 BC, Emperor Wen abolished mutilating punishments. Some punishments that cut off limbs, sliced off noses, or tattooed faces were replaced with flogging, imprisonment, and other alternatives. This reform is usually described as humane government, but it also had an economic meaning. In an agricultural society, the most important form of capital is intact labor power. A person physically damaged by mutilating punishment did not merely lose personal productive capacity. His family lost a laborer, and the state lost a future taxpayer. Abolishing mutilation did not mean the law became weak. It meant punishment shifted from permanently destroying workers to punishing them while preserving their capacity to work. In essence, legal reform under Wen and Jing reduced the destructive cost of social order. The state still punished crime, but it tried not to permanently push usable people out of the production system. The looser social environment also appeared in relatively low interference with speech, commerce, and local production. Emperor Wen abolished harsh speech-related crimes and reduced political fear. The government did not frequently launch massive construction projects, nor did it consume the people's labor through palaces, tombs, and distant expeditions. Commerce was still looked down upon in political ideology, but the Wen and Jing period had not yet created the comprehensive state monopolies over salt, iron, and alcohol that later appeared under Emperor Wu. In other words, state control over society still existed, but everyday economic space was relatively loose. The effects of these ordinary economic policies can ultimately be seen in three indicators. First, population recovered. At the beginning of the Han, the population was roughly between 15 and 18 million. By the end of the rule of Wen and Jing, it had recovered to around 36 million. Even if scholars disagree on the exact numbers, the direction of growth is unmistakable. Second, grain prices and granaries improved. Low taxes, light labor service, and peace together increased the grain supply. Before Emperor Wu came to the throne, state granaries were already quite well stocked. Third, the fiscal structure stabilized. The government did not obtain short-term income by raising the land tax. Instead, by keeping land taxes low, labor service light, and society relatively loose, it gained a larger registered population, more stable cultivated land, and greater long-term extractive capacity. Therefore, the ordinary economic policies of the rule of Wen and Jing were not the result of one isolated measure. They were the combined effect of several low extraction institutions. Lower land taxes, lower poll taxes, less corvée labor, less destructive punishment, reduced court and military spending, and more space for private production. For an agricultural empire, these policies accomplished one essential task. They turned the common people from objects of state consumption back into assets of the state. The ordinary policies of the Wen and Jing period were low land taxes, low corvée obligations, and less destructive punishment, all designed to let agricultural households recover production. But simply collecting less tax could not solve every problem. The northern frontier needed permanent garrisons, soldiers needed grain, horses, fortifications, and transport. The problem was that frontier zones were not the regions richest in grain. Transporting grain from the interior to the border caused enormous losses. According to one estimate used in the supplied material, losses in ancient long-distance grain transport could reach around 70%. Even if we do not use that highest estimate, one point is certain. In an age without railways, modern highways, or mechanized transport, sending one shi of grain from the interior to the frontier cost far more than the grain itself. So one key fiscal problem under Emperor Wen was this: without raising the land tax, how could the state make up the frontier grain shortage? Or, more broadly, how could the treasury function without increasing the burden on ordinary people? The answer of the rule of Wen and Jing was special handling for special needs. Raise resources from the wealthy. One very representative policy, and one that later attracted a great deal of commentary, was the sale of ranks and offices. Commoners delivered grain to the state, and the state granted them noble ranks. But describing this simply as selling ranks understates its financial meaning. More precisely, noble rank in the Wen and Jing period was, in a certain sense, an ancient form of government bond. Of course, it was not a modern paper bond. It had no fixed interest rate, no maturity date, and could not be freely traded on an open market like a US Treasury bond. But it had the core structure of a government bond. The state issued a credential backed by its own credit, raised fiscal resources from society, and promised future repayment in the form of institutional benefits. The logic of a modern government bond is this: you lend money to the state, and the state later repays you with principal and interest. The logic of receiving rank in return for grain in the Han was this: you deliver grain to the state, and the state gives you rank. That rank can later provide status, honor, reductions in labor service, mitigation or exemption in punishment, and other institutional benefits. It was not cash interest, it was status interest. It was not repayment of principal at maturity, it was long-term repayment through privilege. This is exactly where the early agricultural empire showed its intelligence. The state lacked grain, but it possessed an inexhaustible asset: the hierarchy of status. Noble rank was one of the most important status markers in Qin and Han society. Whether a person had rank, and how high that rank was, affected not only face and prestige, but also legal treatment, labor obligations, social standing, and even access to certain political and administrative channels. So the state turned an intangible form of political credit into a fiscal tool that could be exchanged for grain. The design of the Han Empire was very clear. Let us use a simple example to show how this system worked. Take the most direct problem: grain shortages on the frontier. The northern border needed permanent garrisons. Soldiers needed grain, horses, fortifications, and transport. The problem was that the border was not the most grain-rich region. Transporting grain from the interior to the frontier was extremely wasteful. According to the estimates cited above, losses in ancient long-distance grain transport could be as high as around 70%. Even if we do not use that highest estimate, one thing is certain: without railways, modern roads, or mechanical transport, the real cost of delivering one she of grain to the border was far higher than the grain itself. Under the system of selling ranks, the empire did not simply impose more taxes on poor peasants. Instead, it encouraged those in society who had surplus grain and capital to deliver grain to the places where the state needed it most. Historical records state that delivering 600 she of grain to the frontier could earn the rank of Shangzhao. 4,000 she could earn the rank of Wu Dafu, and 12,000 she could earn the rank of Dashu Zhang. In this way, the Han government solved three problems at once. First, the state obtained frontier grain. It made wealthy households, merchants, and local magnates bear the transport costs themselves. The state only had to recognize the rank and receive the grain into frontier granaries. On the fiscal books, the state did not increase the land tax. On the logistical books, the border received grain. Second, it raised grain prices and protected farmers. The managers of an agricultural empire were not only worried about the state lacking grain, they were also worried about the classic problem of cheap grain hurting farmers. In good harvest years, peasants had grain in hand, but prices were low and they could not sell at a good price. They still had to pay the poll tax and still had household expenses. As a result, they might be forced to sell grain cheaply or even sell land and take on debt. The sale of ranks created a huge policy-driven buyer. To obtain rank, wealthy people had to buy grain on the market and deliver it to state granaries. Demand increased, grain prices rose, and farmers earned more from selling grain. In this way, the state did not directly subsidize farmers. Instead, through the market for rank, it directed the money of the wealthy into the grain market, allowing farmers to receive higher income. Han bureaucrats summarized this logic with 6 very precise Chinese characters. Take from surplus, make up for shortage. The part of this system that most resembles government bonds is that it was not a one-time transaction. It was an exchange of credit between the state and society. But all bonds carry risk. If a modern state issues unlimited debt, bond prices fall, credit is damaged, and interest burdens rise. Han noble ranks were the same. If the state sold ranks without limit in exchange for grain, rank would depreciate. If everyone had rank, rank would no longer be scarce. If it was no longer scarce, it could no longer attract wealthy people to deliver grain. And if the state continued selling it more cheaply, soldiers who had earned rank through military merit would feel cheated. The status they had won by bleeding on the battlefield was being purchased by others at lower cost. So the truly impressive part was not issuing rank. It was that the Han Empire had mechanisms to prevent rank from losing value. First, it limited the scope of issuance. The ranks sold during the Wen and Jing period were mainly low and middle ranks, not titles such as marquis or inner marquis, which approached true fiefs and high political resources. Ordinary people could buy ranks roughly from the 1st to the 8th level. Officials could buy somewhat higher ranks, but truly high ranks, real power and fiefs could not be purchased casually. In this way, the state sold status benefits to society without selling core political power. It was like a modern state issuing government bonds without selling sovereignty. Second, it controlled the content of repayment. Most of these ranks were not actual offices. A buyer could gain status, ritual treatment, reduced labor service, lighter punishment, and other benefits. But he did not immediately gain control over armies, commanderies, counties, courts, or finances just because he delivered grain. What the state paid out was not land or office, but institutional privilege. This reduced fiscal cost. The state exchanged low marginal cost honor and status for real grain and transport services. Third, it created a redemption mechanism. This was the crucial point. Qin and Han noble ranks were not things that could only be issued and never recovered. They could be stripped, offset, or consumed by the state. In Qin and Han law, privileges related to rank generally included rank-based mitigation, rank-based exemption, rank-based redemption, and deprivation of rank. Put simply, a person with rank who committed a crime could use that rank to reduce punishment or offset part of his responsibility. But this did not mean the state simply let him go. His rank was consumed, reduced, or even confiscated. From the perspective of modern finance, this was like the state issuing a status bond, while retaining the right to cancel or redeem it. The rank exited circulation and scarcity was preserved. This was the key mechanism that prevented the credit of rank from collapsing. Fourth, rank could be repeatedly used by the state for fiscal mobilization. As long as rank had not been completely devalued, it could be used again in times of war, frontier defense, disaster, or fiscal shortage. The Wen and Jing period used it to obtain frontier grain. Under Emperor Wu, rank and redemption systems would continue to be used in even larger wars. Rank became a reusable credit asset in the state's fiscal toolbox. But the precondition for repeated use was that it could not be issued recklessly until it became worthless. This was already very close to an ancient system of fiscal securities. This system had an even deeper significance. It monetized the Han Empire's status hierarchy. It was a precocious state credit system, issuing government bonds in the form of noble rank, paying interest in privilege, raising capital in grain, redeeming bonds through law, and preserving credit through the scarcity of rank. Another major political and economic problem in the early Han was the existence of the regional kingdoms. In the early Western Han, Territory directly controlled by the emperor coexisted for a long time with semi-autonomous kingdoms ruled by imperial princes. At that time, the kingdoms together held more than 20 commanderies, while the central government directly controlled only 15. In name, the Han Empire was already unified, but large amounts of land, population, and fiscal resources were not fully in the hands of the central government. These princes were not ordinary local officials. Local officials were appointed by the central government. They could be transferred, evaluated, and punished. Princes were different. They held hereditary lands, possessed imperial clan status, appointed officials within their kingdoms, collected taxes, controlled armies, and in some periods even participated in minting coins. For the central government, the real danger was not simply that a particular prince had ambition. It was that the kingdoms had independent fiscal capacity. For example, powerful kingdoms such as Wu possessed copper mines and salt fields. Copper meant raw material for coinage. Salt meant a necessity of daily life. If a kingdom could control both salt and copper, in addition to its own land and population, it was not merely a local administrative unit. It was a small fiscal state. It could reduce burdens on its own people, attract migrants, accumulate military supplies, and expand armaments. It could even subsidize the population with local resources and compete with the central government for people. This shows that the relationship between the kingdoms and the center was not one of simple obedience. It was a competition for tax base and population. The right to mint money was one of the core issues in this competition. In less than 100 years, the central government repeatedly wavered over whether private coinage should be allowed. This was partly because it lacked sufficient financial management experience, but more importantly, because it was competing with the kingdoms for control over coinage. At first, Wu had copper mines. The king of Wu recruited people, opened mines, made money, and earned enormous profits. The central government tried to ban private minting. But even when the central government threatened the death penalty, Wu had an independent judicial system and could simply ignore central policy. Where profit existed, there were always people willing to risk death. By the time of Emperor Wen, the central government changed course. It abolished the ban on private minting and allowed private coinage. Why? To fight a monetary war against Wu. At the same time, it issued coinage standards and imposed severe punishments on anyone who debased coins. But enforcement was still poor. Ordinary people chased profits, abandoned farming, and went off to mint coins. The coins they produced were unreliable, often debased, and impossible to police fully. This is why, under Emperor Wen, something happened that many people find hard to understand. Why would Emperor Wen, remembered as one of the wisest rulers in Chinese history, grant an entire mountain in Shu to a favorite named Deng Tong, allowing him to mine and mint coins on a large scale? The reason is actually simple. Deng Tong was Emperor Wen's proxy. The 4 Ju coins minted by Deng Tong were of very high quality. They circulated throughout the Han market and competed evenly with Wu coins, while also producing large profits. This later became a kind of trial run for the state-run salt and iron monopolies, and the equal transportation and price stabilization policies of Emperor Wu's reign. When political tools cannot solve economic problems, war becomes the final outcome. The greatest internal crisis of the Han Empire during the rule of Wen and Jing occurred in 154 BC. The traditional name for this conflict is the Rebellion of the Seven Kingdoms. On the surface, it was a rebellion by 7 imperial princes against Emperor Jing's Cao-fan policy, the reduction of princely power. At a deeper level, it was the early Han Empire choosing between 2 systems. Should the state be an empire with unified taxation, unified appointments, and unified coinage under the central government? Or should it be a loose federation composed of the center and semi-autonomous kingdoms? In other words, the kingdoms of the early Western Han were not ordinary administrative regions. They were small political economies embedded inside the empire. There were historical reasons for this arrangement. After the founding of the dynasty, the central government was still weak. It needed imperial clan kingdoms as buffers to control newly conquered regions, suppress non-clan military founders, and stabilize local order. But decades later, the problem reversed. War had ended, population had recovered, agricultural production had grown, and the regional kingdoms had grown wealthy as well. The more the central government practiced recovery and rest, the more time powerful kingdoms had to accumulate resources. The most typical example was Wu in the southeast. After Emperor Jing came to the throne, the pace of Saifan clearly accelerated. The technical method was not simply to declare princes guilty, but to use legal and administrative reasons to reclaim parts of their territories. If a kingdom committed ritual impropriety, land was cut away. If a kingdom violated administrative law, land was cut away. If a kingdom long refused to obey the center, land was cut away. The result was a direct reduction in the population, land tax, mineral resources, and strategic routes controlled by the princes. For the princes, this was not a matter of face. It was a balance sheet problem. If a kingdom lost one commandery, it lost land, registered households, tax sources, and part of its mobilizable manpower. Saifan did not remove colors from a map. It cut away the kingdom's long-term cash flow. In 154 BC, the king of Wu was the first to rise in rebellion. Chu, Zhao, and several kingdoms in the Qi region then joined. Traditional military figures placed the Wu army at around 200,000 men, with the other rebel forces together reaching around 300,000, for a total of about 500,000. These numbers may contain the usual exaggeration found in ancient war records, but they at least show that the regional kingdoms possessed very strong mobilization capacity. The central government was not facing scattered unrest. It was facing a coalition of multiple fiscal units and military political groups. The rebels used the slogan, "Remove the evil ministers around the ruler." This was typical political packaging. It did not openly deny the emperor. Instead, it claimed that bad men around the emperor had to be removed, especially the officials who supported Saifan. For an English-speaking audience, we might explain it this way. The rebels did not begin by declaring that they wanted to overthrow the entire dynasty. They framed the war as an attempt to restore proper order. This reduced the moral cost of rebellion and could attract forces still waiting to see which side would win. At first, Emperor Jing did waver. The minister who had led the Saifan policy was executed. But this did not stop the war. The reason was simple. The seven kingdoms were not fighting over the life or death of one minister. They were fighting over the central government's Saifan policy itself. The key to the war was not frontal battle, but logistics. The central commander did not rush to relieve the besieged kingdom of Liang, which was held by the emperor's own younger brother. Instead, he chose to control strategic routes and cut off the supply lines of the main Wu and Chu forces. This choice was extremely important. The larger the rebel army, the more dependent it was on grain. If it could not achieve a quick breakthrough, a military force of 500,000 men would rapidly become a black hole for food. The advantage of the Wu-Chu forces lay in money, resources, and initial troop strength. Their weakness lay in long-distance operations and exposed supply lines. The Central Army's strategy was to turn the war from a question of who is braver into who can keep supplying grain longer. In the end, the rebellion was suppressed in roughly 3 months. The king of Wu was defeated, the king of Chu committed suicide, and the other participating kingdoms were gradually dealt with. But the real significance for the rule of Wen and Jing was not the 3-month military campaign. It was the institutional result after the war. After the rebellion, the central government gained political justification to compress princely power. The kingdoms still existed. Royal titles still existed. Imperial clan prestige still existed. But real power was weakened. The center began to control more tightly the appointment of kingdom officials, fiscal income, military mobilization, and coinage. After Emperor Jing, Emperor Wu continued this trend. Eventually, through the further division of kingdoms, the recovery of minting rights, and the strengthening of the central bureaucracy, the kingdoms were gradually transformed from actual local governments into aristocratic fiefs with titles, limited income, and weak military capacity. Of course, no economic miracle can be separated from some form of strong leadership, or from the distinctive personal charisma of the highest ruler. Think of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore's rise, Deng Xiaoping in Reform-era China, or Emperor Wen during the rule of Wen and Jing. From the founding emperor Liu Bang to Empress Lu, and then to Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, the early Han Empire went through at least 4 consecutive political stages during its recovery and rapid development. Each stage had internal struggles, and each had policy fluctuations. But one basic direction remained intact. After the war was over, the state could not continue to squeeze society as if it were still in wartime. The early Han leadership did not suddenly become benevolent. Rather, after the collapse of Qin and the devastation of the Chu-Han War, it reached a realistic conclusion. If the new dynasty continued to use high extraction, massive construction, harsh punishments, and high military spending, it would repeat Qin's failure. The role of the founding emperor was to preserve the Qin state machine, but reduce the intensity with which it was used. Qin had left behind commanderies and counties, household registration, law, roads, weights and measures, and document-based administration. Han did not abolish all of these institutions. On the contrary, it inherited the skeleton of the unified empire. The difference was that after the founding, the Han government gradually reduced land taxes and corvée pressure, so that this skeleton no longer bled society as it had at the end of Qin. In other words, early Han policy was not anti-Qin. It was keep the efficiency of Qin institutions, but reduce the violent consumption of Qin-style rule. One particularly unusual figure in this process was Empress Lu. Her political image in traditional narratives is very negative. But from the perspective of economic continuity, she did not push the country back toward massive war and heavy taxation. She dominated politics roughly from 195 to 180 BC. During this period, northern pressure remained, and internal relations within the imperial clan were unstable. Yet the state as a whole did not launch the kind of long expeditions that would later appear under Emperor Wu. Even when the arrogant Xiongnu Chanyu sent her a letter that insulted her personally, she ultimately endured it and did not choose a large-scale retaliatory war that would have exhausted the people and the treasury. At the same time, monetary policy under Empress Lu did involve significant intervention, including bans on private minting and the reissue of state coinage, which at one point created problems in prices and circulation. This shows that although Empress Lu was ruthless toward Liu clan princes and founding ministers, when dealing with economic issues, she was more inclined to experiment with policy tools than to drive social recovery through bloody rule. After Empress Lu, Emperor Wen came to the throne, and the policy center of the early Han shifted in a more stable direction. This shift is usually summarized as Huang-Lao thought. This was a governing philosophy deeply influenced by Taoist ideas. Its most important implications can be reduced to 3 points. First, the government should interfere less. Second, the law should harm people less. Third, war should be launched less often. The early Western Han court from the highest ruler to advisors such as Zhang Liang, did indeed favor Huang-Lao thought and use it as a philosophy of statecraft, not merely as a private moral cultivation. Of course, whether a policy is good or bad is one matter. Whether it fits the conditions of the time is another. But the most important question is whether it can continue. In the continuity of early Han economic and social policy, one person played a crucial role: Empress Dowager Dou, the wife of Emperor Wen. Her role was to ensure that this philosophy did not remain tied only to Emperor Wen personally, but continued into the reign of Emperor Jing and even the early reign of Emperor Wu. In a sense, Empress Dowager Dou's presence in Changlei Palace symbolized the dominant position of Huang-Lao thought in early Han political economy. A governing style that lasted nearly 40 years would have been very difficult to sustain across generations without the support of a core figure in the court who accepted this low-consumption path. The clearest example of Huang-Lao practice appears in the personal conduct of Emperor Wen. His special quality was that he turned frugality into fiscal discipline. This is one of the reasons he was later praised as a model ruler for all ages. Emperor Wen once planned to build a terrace. When the estimated cost came to 100 jin of gold, equivalent to the assets of 10 middle-income households, he cancelled the project. His clothing, carriages, horses and curtains were all kept modest. His tomb did not imitate the massive engineering of the first emperor of Qin's mausoleum. It did not use large amounts of gold and silver as burial goods, and it tried to minimize the use of the people's labor. These details are not merely moral anecdotes. They should be understood as fiscal signals. In an imperial society, the emperor's consumption had an exemplary effect. If the emperor expanded palaces, local officials would build larger offices. If the emperor pursued lavish burial, nobles would follow. If the emperor loved war, frontier military spending would devour tax revenue. Emperor Wen's personal frugality actually lowered the consumption expectations of the entire ruling group. It did not create grain directly, but it reduced the speed at which the state converted grain and labor into non-productive projects. Frontier policy followed the same logic. During Emperor Wen's reign, the Northern Steppe Empire continued to threaten the frontier. In 177 BC, the Xiongnu launched a large-scale invasion, carrying off people and livestock. In 162 BC, Emperor Wen restarted peace negotiations with the north through a new imperial edict. In 158 BC, there were again two southward attacks, each involving roughly 30,000 men, and the Han government sent out 6 armies in response. In other words, Emperor Wen did not live in a vacuum free from war threats. He faced real border crises. But his approach still prioritized avoiding total war. Early Han peace arrangements with the northern peoples included marriage alliances, gifts, border markets, diplomatic letters, and military defense. Modern research generally holds that these policies could not bring permanent security, because the internal structure of nomadic confederations was loose. Even if the supreme leader reached an agreement, he could not completely restrain all subordinate groups. But from a fiscal perspective, these policies at least delayed total war. Emperor Wen used goods, marriage alliances, and frontier markets to buy time. Time allowed population to recover. Population recovery allowed cultivated land to expand. Expanded cultivated land later produced state reserves. What Emperor Jing inherited was not simple gentleness, but restraint with boundaries. The rebellion of the Seven Kingdoms showed that once regional princes threatened the fiscal and military unity of the central government, the center would still use force. This was not a minor frontier irritation, but a deep internal danger that could decide the survival of the empire. After suppressing the rebellion, the central government continued to recover princely power, But in its treatment of ordinary people, agricultural taxes, and routine state spending, Emperor Jing did not overturn Emperor Wen's line. After 154 BC, the empire did not immediately move into large-scale foreign wars just because it had won the rebellion. It continued to maintain internal recovery. Only after Emperor Wu came to the throne in 141 BC did the state gradually enter a new age of high military mobilization. The massive expeditions under Emperor Wu did expand the empire's territory, but the cost was enormous. Around 119 BC, during the Great Northern Campaigns, the Han army lost horses on the scale of 110,000, and the fiscal cost of war was huge. Afterward, the government promoted currency reform and introduced fiscal tools such as state monopolies over salt and iron. These consequences, in reverse, reveal the value of the Wen and Jing period. It delayed high-cost warfare for decades, allowing the empire to accumulate wealth before entering the expansion stage. So the personal role in the rule of Wen and Jing was not that a certain emperor was naturally kind. It was more like a sequence of rulers repeatedly choosing a low-consumption path. The founder preserved the unified state machine but reduced extraction. Empress Lu maintained general stability and experimented with monetary policy. Emperor Wen institutionalized frugality, low taxes, lighter punishment, and delayed war. Emperor Jing weakened the regional kingdoms while continuing a recovery-based fiscal policy. In a system where centralized power naturally tends to expand, the hardest thing is not to make government do more. It is to make government, when it has the ability to take more, build more, and fight more, choose instead to take less, build less, and fight less. If we place the Han Empire of the Wen and Jing period on a world historical map, the most suitable comparison is the Roman Republic of the 2nd century BC. Both states became wealthier during the same period, but they became wealthy in completely different ways. The Han Empire's wealth growth came mainly from internal agricultural recovery. The government lowered land taxes, reduced corvée labor, softened the destructive force of punishment, and avoided long, large-scale wars. This allowed population, land, grain, and household productive capacity to grow continuously. The core wealth of the Wen and Jing era was not one-time plunder. It was the continuous recovery of population and agricultural output. The Roman Republic was the opposite. In the 2nd century BC, Rome kept winning across the Mediterranean. Victory brought not agricultural recovery, but booty, indemnities, slaves, mines, provincial taxes, and trade routes. Around 167 BC, Rome stopped levying its traditional war tax on citizens in Italy. This date offers a very useful comparison with the Han Empire. Around the same time, Emperor Wen abolished the land tax, and Rome also freed its citizens from direct war taxation. But the fiscal logic behind these two events was different. The Han Empire abolished the land tax because the central government actively compressed spending and left wealth in the hands of farming households, using low taxes to cultivate a future tax base. Rome stopped collecting the war tax from citizens because after military victories, the state obtained large amounts of funding from outside, especially indemnities from defeated states and income from conquered regions. In other words, Han tax relief came from taking less from internal society. Roman tax relief came from taking more from the outside world. Rome's original war tax was mainly levied on property-owning citizens eligible for military service and was used to pay military expenses. It was not a modern income tax, but a wartime fiscal responsibility based on property class. After 167 BC, citizens in Italy were long exempt from this direct tax, and Rome's fiscal pressure increasingly shifted to provinces, allies, and conquered regions. Provincial inhabitants bore land taxes, poll taxes, tribute, customs duties, and the additional exploitation of tax farmers. This created two different directions of wealth flow. In the Han Empire, wealth flowed from farming households to local granaries and then to the central treasury. During the Wen and Jing period, the government deliberately slowed this flow, allowing more grain to remain temporarily within farming households and village society. What the state gained was long-term population growth, long-term restoration of cultivated land, and future taxable capacity. In the Roman Republic, wealth flowed from conquered regions into Italy, then spread through the treasury, the army, aristocrats, equestrian contractors, and urban consumption. Large amounts of silver, slaves, and land income entered Italy, encouraging the expansion of large estates and putting pressure on traditional small farmers. Rome's military victories increased the state's cash capacity, but at the same time created problems of land concentration, slave labor, and an urban proletariat. Overall, the Han Empire was a typical agricultural state. It cared about household registration, land, adult population, grain storage, corvée frequency, and grain routes to the frontier. The state's main problems were how to prevent farmers from fleeing, how to bring land back into cultivation, how to keep grain flowing steadily into granaries, and how to feed frontier armies. Even later fiscal expansion, including state management of salt and iron and currency monopoly, was mainly organized around the control of internal resources. The Roman Republic, by contrast, was a military commercial republic. It cared about legions, war booty, indemnities, provincial taxes, maritime trade, mines, and the import of slaves. The state's main problems were how to keep war-producing revenue, how to manage conquered territories, and how to convert external wealth into political advantage at home. Rome certainly had agriculture. Italian farming and the Mediterranean grain supply were both very important. But the most striking variable in Roman wealth growth during the 2nd century BC was external expansion. Now look at Ptolemaic Egypt. Egypt was certainly rich. The Nile Valley was one of the most stable grain-producing regions of the ancient world, and Alexandria was one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic dynasty possessed a highly developed bureaucratic taxation system. Through grain, cash, monopolized industries, and royal land, it could concentrate the output of the Nile Valley in the hands of the royal house. Within the Hellenistic world, Ptolemaic Egypt was long one of the wealthiest kingdoms. But by the 2nd century BC, its problems were also clear. First, its geographical base was too narrow. Egypt's wealth was highly concentrated in the Nile Valley and Delta. It was extremely fertile, but it was not a continental empire with tens of millions of agricultural people spread across several Great Plains. Second, its state scale could not compare with Han. Ptolemaic Egypt was a wealthy kingdom, but not a unified empire with a vast interior, enormous registered population, multiple agricultural regions, and deep strategic space like Han China. Third, it was already under Roman pressure. In 168 BC, when the Seleucid king advanced toward Alexandria, a Roman envoy forced him to withdraw with an order from the Senate. This showed that Egypt, though rich, no longer possessed strategic initiative. If a country has great wealth, but increasingly relies on another power for diplomatic and military security, it is hard to call it the strongest state in the world. Now look at the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids had once ruled one of the largest states inherited from Alexander's empire, stretching from Syria and Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau and at times even approaching the borders of India. They controlled many ancient and wealthy regions, possessed great cities, trade routes, Hellenistic armies, and complex taxation systems. But by the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid state was no longer a rising empire. It was a collapsing one. After the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC, the Seleucids were forced to give up major interests in Asia Minor and pay a huge indemnity. They were pressed by Rome in the west, cut apart by Parthia and the Greco-Bactrian world in the east, and troubled by constant struggles over the throne at home. Around 141 BC, Parthia seized the major Mesopotamian city of Seleucia, meaning that the Seleucids had lost a core region in the east. So the Seleucid problem was not that it lacked historical accumulation. It had cities, tax sources, and trade routes. But its ability to integrate the state was collapsing. It could not concentrate those resources reliably, and it certainly could not, like the Han Empire, complete internal recovery, centralization, and fiscal accumulation within a few decades. Now look at Parthia. Parthia was a very important rising power in the 2nd century BC. It emerged from the Iranian plateau, relied on the military advantages of cavalry, and gradually took over the Seleucid inheritance in the east. By the time of Mithridates I, Parthia had entered Mesopotamia and become the new major actor in Western Asia. But at the point corresponding to the Wen and Jing period, Parthia was still in a phase of expansion and integration. It was a rising military aristocratic state, not yet a continental empire with completed household registration, unified finance, a stable agricultural tax base, and mature bureaucratic governance. Its strength lay in military mobility and geopolitical expansion, not in agricultural population scale or administrative penetration. Finally, look at ancient India. The Mauryan Empire had once been an extraordinarily powerful empire in South Asian history, but it had ended around 185 BC. After that, northern India entered a period in which the Shunga dynasty, regional kingdoms, Indo-Greek states, and northwestern outside powers coexisted. This means that India in the 2nd century BC was still one of the world's most populous, agriculturally developed, and culturally vibrant regions. But it was no longer the highly integrated empire of Ashoka's age. The Shunga dynasty controlled the Middle Ganges and parts of central India, but it did not restore the Mauryan scale that had once covered much of South Asia. In the northwest, the Indo-Greek kings had active coinage, trade, and military power, and rulers such as Menander were influential. But these states were regional kingdoms, not a unified fiscal state capable of representing the entire Indian subcontinent. So the final conclusion is this. In the 2nd century BC, the Han Empire was unquestionably one of the largest economic powers in the world, and very likely the greatest. And the path by which it developed, an inward-looking economy built through internal recovery, state capacity, and the mobilization of domestic resources, seems to carry a subtle echo of China's development in the modern world.